Speaker 1 is code 4561, answering the question, will big tech find themselves the subject of congressional legislation? Will big tech find themselves the subject of congressional legislation?
Back in the old days, it was as if parents would save up every penny that they had to buy themselves a computer and get their kids on the internet. Because after all, it was where everything happened. And it seems like in today's world, parents do something similar. They save up every penny that they have to get themselves a computer, but rather keep their kids off of it. Because it's where everything happens. But especially when considering that it almost seems as if everything that happens is controlled by the same people time and time again. In fact, as Reuters explained just 3 days ago, the companies of Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, and Apple, which made over $1.4 trillion in 2021 alone, wield an insurmountable amount of market power. An amount of market power that simply is unethical and too much to bear in today's age for a small amount of companies. And especially when acknowledging that these companies are taking our right as Americans to privacy and are throwing it in the trash, that it becomes imperative to ask ourselves today's all-important question. Will big tech find themselves the subject of congressional legislation? To which the answer, simply put, is an absolute yes because of their numerous unethical business practices. By more specifically, first, understanding the major issue of the advertising industry. Second, the major conflict of acquisitions and their mass product. And ultimately, by understanding the mass issue of big tech's lobbying crisis. Now, everyone take a sec and just listen. Do you guys hear that? That is Google listening to this speech right now. Because when you open up your phones next, I guarantee you'll see an advertisement for speechanddebate.org/live. And this is exactly the first reason as to why big tech will enact congressional legislation, because of the mass crisis of the advertising industry. In fact, Politico explained on May 6th of this year that those same companies that I mentioned earlier, but particularly Google, are major players in the advertising industry. And although we may think of Google as a search giant, rather they are simply an advertising company. In fact, the article continues that in just the first quarter of 2022 alone, Google made over $68 billion. But 80% of that was directly due to their advertising monopoly. Essentially, Google holds the forefront on advertising as we know it. But the practices are significantly unethical when you examine how far it goes beneath the surface. The Brookings Institution explained on April 11th of this year that these practices are extremely malicious because they are able to control them, that is, Google. They are able to push their own products and services directly to the top of the search bar. And when further considering that Google's market share conducts over 1 billion internet users every single year, being 90% of all of those who use the internet, it is clear that this ability to reach nearly every single person in the world who uses the internet is simply unethical and must receive congressional legislation as soon as possible. Now, the word politics comes from the Greek. Poly meaning many, and tick meaning blood-sucking parasite, which is why politicians need to stop acting like ticks and focus on solving this crisis and introduce congressional legislation as soon as possible. And the second reason is because of the major crisis of acquisitions. The Urban Institute, a notable public policy think tank, explained on April 1st of this year that the acquisition crisis for big tech is severe. Because in the year 2021 alone, the companies of Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook bought more smaller companies in just 2021 than they had in the past decade. Essentially, these companies are buying and eating up smaller companies just to gain a bigger share of the market. And that bigger competition that they are taking up is unethical because they are driving away other small businesses and competitive business practices that make consumerism as we know it the fair system as we try to make it to be. But when considering that these companies are eating up companies left and right, they are taking away competitiveness as we know it. In fact, the New York Times elaborates on May 9th of this year that this acquisition process is so drastic that even Google, or rather Facebook, was able to take up Instagram in 2011 for $1 billion because Mark Zuckerberg at the time believed that as a company with just 13 employees, it was far too powerful. Clearly, situations like this prove why Congress must bring congressional legislation, because when companies like Facebook are bringing forward drastic legislation, or rather acquisitions to companies with small employees of just 13, because they fear it's going to be too unsafe, they are too worried for something that is simply not going to happen. But finally, let's turn to famous philosopher and intellectual speaker, Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, who once said that with great power comes great responsibility. And that advice should be given directly to Congress, because they must enact congressional legislation, especially because of the issue of mass lobbying in Congress. The Washington Post explained on May 13th of this year that the Computer and Controversy Activism Association explained on May 9th of this year that, simply put, this association that represents the majority of big tech companies made the biggest donation of lobbying to Congress in history to protect the antitrust abilities of those big tech companies. In fact, they made an over $27 million donation, the biggest in recorded history, to try and protect these big tech companies from facing the action of Congress that are trying to break them apart using antitrust legislation. Legislation that simply states that competitive market practices must be used. And as a matter of fact, as the Wall Street Journal explains on April 16th of this year, this legislation has been used before and has worked, but Congress must use it again. In fact, in 2007, Amazon founder and CEO Jeff Bezos used market practices to undercut the business Diapers.com, which was, again, selling just diapers, and started losing millions upon millions of dollars to drive out the business. And within just months, that small business that was selling diapers went extinct. It seems as if the only person who needs a diaper is Jeff Bezos, because this is simply something that shouldn't have to happen. And so, when looking back at today's all-important question, will big tech find themselves the subject of congressional legislation? The answer, simply put, is an absolute yes because of their numerous unethical business practices. By more specifically, first, understanding the crisis of advertising. Second, the issue of mass acquisitions, and ultimately the problems with big lobbying. And so clearly, the internet is where everything happens. But everything should happen fairly.
Our first speaker is going to be cross-examined by our sixth speaker, which is code 4636.
Congratulations on an awesome speech.
Thank you.
I just have a few questions.
Of course.
So on your first point, the Sherman antitrust law states that if a company has a monopoly over an industry, it's actually legal if they've gained that monopoly through fair means. So just because Google has a monopoly over the ad market doesn't mean that it actually invites legislation.
Well, I'd actually argue that Google is not being fair nor ethical because they're using their own products and their services to boost them to the top of the search engines that they're marketing. And so considering that Google even owns the second biggest advertiser, YouTube, it's clear they're holding a big monopoly over how these ads are distributed, bought, and sold.
Okay, and on your second point, if these acquisitions have been happening for literally years, why hasn't congressional legislation happened in the past? And it hasn't, so why would it happen in the future?
Well, it actually has been brought forward to Congress in the past. It has brought time and time again by legislators who believe that big tech companies need to stop eating up competition. The issue then is that it wasn't in the favor of bipartisan action. But when considering that now, senators such as Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah, are agreeing with Democrats that big tech companies must be suppressed, it's clear that now there's bipartisan action and their legislation will be enacted.
Okay, and an overarching question about your entire speech. With the majority of American congressmen in the House and the Senate focused on other domestic issues like the elections, but also the January 6th riots, how will anyone actually find the time to debate and pass legislation on tech which isn't really a relevant discussion right now.
Well, I'd actually argue that, as you mentioned, the January 6th riots, for example, were influenced by big tech themselves. For example, the advertising industry that is used on Facebook, which is another monopoly marketing practice, was directly used to influence riots like the one we saw on January 6th.
Thank you so much.